I stared at a gleaming white marquee tent, a portable dance floor, and dozens folding chairs set up right under my 200-year-old oak tree, while the local homeowners association president stood on my land in a silver gown and ordered me to move my pickup truck because it was ruining the sightlines for her niece's stolen wedding venue. I did not yell. I did not throw a fit. I just walked down to my barn, climbed onto my faded green tractor, and fired up a 2,000-gallon manure spreader filled to the absolute brim with the most pungent, concentrated liquid dairy fertilizer in the county. My name is Elias. I am 48 years old, and I run the 60-acre farm my grandfather bought 70 years ago. Before I tell you how this woman's pristine, hijacked high society wedding turned into a cinematic nightmare of flying brown mist and ruined stilettos, you need to know how we got here. Because you do not just accidentally spray an entire string quartet with liquid cow manure. You have to be pushed exactly to the edge. My grandfather bought this land 70 years ago. Back then, it was nothing but dirt roads and dairy farms for 20 miles in every direction. Now, it is just me, 60 acres of rolling pasture, and a massive housing development that crept up on my eastern property line like a fungus. They call it the Whispering Pines. There are no pines, and the only whispering is the sound of neighbors gossiping over their vinyl fences. I do not mind neighbors. I really do not. You stay on your side of the property line, I stay on mine, and we give each other a little wave when we drive past. That is the country way. But Whispering Pines was not built for country people. It was built for people who want the aesthetic of the countryside without any of the actual dirt. Enter Brenda. I first met Brenda on a Tuesday morning in early April. I was fixing a fence post near the property line, minding my own business, when I heard the crunch of gravel. I looked up to see a woman marching toward me. She wore crisp white capri pants, a salmon-colored blouse, and a visor that cast a shadow over a tightly clamped jaw. She was clutching a plastic clipboard to her chest like it was the Holy Grail. She stopped exactly 2 inches from the rusted wire fence, looked down at her spotless white tennis shoes, and then glared up at me. She did not say hello. She did not introduce herself. She just held up the clipboard and tapped it with a perfectly manicured finger. "You have a commercial vehicle parked in plain view," she said. Her voice sounded like a lawnmower blade hitting a rock. "It is a violation of the neighborhood aesthetic guidelines." I looked over my shoulder. Parked about 50 yards away, entirely on my property, was my tractor. It is a big, faded green machine that has been running since before Brenda was born. "That is a tractor," I said. I leaned against the wooden post and wiped the sweat off my forehead. She sighed. It was that heavy, exaggerated sigh a kindergarten teacher gives a child who keeps eating paste. Whatever it is an eyesore. We have an open house at the model home this weekend, and I cannot have prospective buyers looking at agricultural debris. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I am giving you a formal warning. Next time, it is a fine. I looked at her. I looked at the tractor. I looked back at her. "Brenda," I said, guessing her name before she even offered it. "I do not live in Whispering Pines. I am not in your association. This is a working farm." She adjusted her visor. Her smile was tight and completely devoid of warmth. "We will see about that," she said. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her subdivision, dodging mud puddles with the precision of an Olympic gymnast. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. I figured she would go back to her desk, pull up the property maps, realize I was right, and find someone else to bother. I underestimated the sheer, relentless stubbornness of an entitled woman with a clipboard. Over the next 3 months, my mailbox became a dumping ground for her delusions. I received printed notices about the length of my grass in the south pasture. I received a strongly worded letter about the smell of livestock. I do not even own livestock anymore, just one old barn cat. But Brenda apparently found the smell of damp earth and alfalfa offensive. I ignored every single letter. I threw them in the woodstove. I figured if I gave her zero oxygen, the fire would eventually burn out. That was my first mistake. Patience, to someone like Brenda, is just an invitation to push harder. The crown jewel of my property is a massive 200-year-old oak tree that sits on a little ridge overlooking the valley. It is beautiful. It is the kind of spot where you just want to sit with a cup of black coffee and watch the sun come up. It is about a quarter mile from my house, but it backs right up to the edge of the Whispering Pines subdivision. It was a Friday morning in late September. The air was crisp, the sky was that deep, endless blue, and I had a long list of chores. I drove into town to pick up some parts for the baler, grabbed a sandwich, and spent a few hours talking to the guys at the feed store. I got back to the farm around 2 in the afternoon. As I drove up my gravel driveway, I looked toward the ridge. I stopped the truck. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. There was a tent. Not a little camping tent. A massive, gleaming white marquee tent with peaked roofs and little flags snapping in the breeze. I put the truck in a park and left the engine running. I walked up the hill, the dry grass crunching under my boots. The closer I got, the worse it became. There were 100 white folding chairs set up in perfect, symmetrical rows beneath the oak tree. There were floral arches wrapped in pink roses. There was a portable dance floor being laid down by a crew of 4 guys in matching polo shirts, and standing right in the middle of it all, pointing and directing traffic, was Brenda. She was wearing a beige pantsuit today, holding her trusty clipboard, shouting at a teenager carrying a stack of linen tablecloths. I walked right up to the edge of the dance floor. "Brenda," I said. My voice was very quiet. She spun around. For a second, just a split second, her eyes went wide. But she recovered instantly. Her face settled into that familiar condescending mask. "Oh, good, you are here," she said. She waved her hand at the truck down the hill. "You are going to need to move that vehicle. It is ruining the sight lines." I stared at her. I looked at the chairs. I looked at the dance floor. I looked back at her. "What is this, Brenda?" "It is a wedding, obviously," she said, crossing her arms. "My niece is getting married tomorrow afternoon. I told her this ridge has the best sunset views in the county. It is the perfect venue." "This is my property," I said. I kept my voice steady. I did not yell. Yelling means you have lost control. She rolled her eyes and let out a sharp little laugh. "Oh, please. You have dozens of acres. You are not even using this spot. It is just an empty field full of weeds. We are only going to be here until Saturday night. The cleanup crew comes Sunday morning. It is not a big deal. You need to be a good neighbor for once in your life. If you have ever had someone look you dead in the eye, stand on soil you pay taxes on, and explain to you why they are perfectly entitled to take your things, you know exactly what my heart was doing in that moment. It is a very specific kind of rage. It is cold. It sits right in the back of your throat. If you are tracking with me, drop a comment and tell me the most unhinged thing a neighbor has ever tried to pull on you. I read them all, and it honestly makes me feel better to know I am not the only one dealing with this level of crazy. "You have 1 hour, I said. "Excuse me," Brenda snapped. "You have 1 hour to get these guys to pack up this tent, these chairs, and this dance floor and get off my land. After that, I am calling the sheriff." Brenda squared her shoulders. She stepped right up to me. She smelled like aggressively synthetic lavender. "Call them," she whispered. "We have an easement." I checked the county records. This ridge is part of a historical scenic overlook. You cannot legally bar us from accessing it. Plus, the rental company already set the tent anchors. You cannot make us leave. I did not say another word. I turned around, walked down the hill, got in my truck, and called the sheriff. 2 deputies arrived 40 minutes later. One was an older guy I knew vaguely from around town, and the other was a young kid who looked like he had graduated from the academy about 3 days ago. We all walked up the hill together. Brenda was waiting for us, clipboard out, wearing a smile so fake it could have been sold in a plastic wrapper. "Officers," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Thank you so much for coming out. This man is harassing my workers and threatening to ruin my niece's wedding. The older deputy tipped his hat. Ma'am, this gentleman says you were trespassing on his property. Brenda whipped out a stack of papers from her clipboard. She shoved them toward the deputy. Not true. This specific ridge falls under the Whispering Pines Scenic Easement Clause, established in the original zoning permits. He has no right to restrict our access. The deputy took the papers. He squinted at them. He looked at the tent. He looked at me. Now, I knew for a fact there was no scenic easement. My grandfather made sure of that when he sold the eastern parcels. Brenda had printed out some boilerplate HOA bylaws and highlighted a few random paragraphs. But the deputy was not a property lawyer. Listen, the deputy said, handing the papers back. I cannot verify property lines or zoning disputes out here on a Friday afternoon. The county clerk's office is closed. As far as I can tell, this is a civil matter. A civil matter, I repeated. My voice was very soft. Yeah, the deputy said, looking apologetic. You guys are going to have to take this to a judge on Monday. I cannot go ripping down a $10,000 rental tent without a court order. If I am wrong, the county is liable. If you touch it, you are liable for property damage. My advice: just let them have the party tomorrow and sue the association next week. I looked at Brenda. She was practically vibrating with triumph. She gave me a tiny, victorious smirk. She had won. She played the bureaucracy perfectly. She knew the cops would not touch a murky property dispute on a weekend. She had stolen my land, and the law was telling me to wait my turn. The deputies left. Brenda went back to adjusting her floral arrangements. I walked down to the barn. I sat on an overturned bucket in the dim light of the barn, listening to the dust settle. I was not going to sue her on Monday. I was not going to let them have the party. But the deputy was right about one thing. If I took a chainsaw to those tent poles, I would be the one going to jail for destruction of property. I could not touch the tent. I could not touch the chairs. I heard the heavy rattle of a diesel engine coming up the driveway. A faded blue pickup truck parked near the barn doors. My neighbor Dave stepped out. Dave is in his 60s, built like a brick wall, and speaks about 10 words a day. He wandered into the barn, pulled 2 cold bottles of root beer out of his jacket pockets, and handed me one. He leaned against the wooden beams, popped the cap off his bottle with a pair of pliers, and looked out the open barn doors toward the ridge. Big tent, Dave said. Yeah, I said. Yours? No. Dave took a slow drink. He looked at the tent again. He looked down at his boots. Then he looked over at the back corner of my barn. Sitting in the shadows was my manure spreader. It is a beautiful piece of machinery. It hooks up to the power takeoff shaft on the back of the tractor. It holds about 2,000 gallons of liquid dairy fertilizer. When you fire up that shaft, a massive steel auger in the back spins at high speed, taking all that thick, potent, nitrogen-rich liquid and flinging it 30 feet into the air in a magnificent, continuous arc. Dave looked back at me. Grass looks a little thin up on that ridge, he said. It does, I agreed. Needs fertilizer. It is the season for it. Dave nodded once. Need a hand greasing the auger bearings. I would appreciate that, Dave. We spent the next 2 hours getting the machine ready. We hitched it to the old green tractor. We drove over to the dairy farm 3 miles down the road, owned by a guy who had dealt with Brenda complaining about his trucks on the county highway. When I told him what I needed, he did not even charge me. He just smiled, fired up his pumps, and filled my tank to the absolute brim with the most pungent, concentrated, eye-watering liquid manure his cows had to offer. This was not solid manure. This was the liquid slurry. It has a smell that defies description. It does not just sit in your nose. It coats your throat. It makes your eyes water. It clings to fabric, to hair, to memory. We parked the tractor in the barn and waited. Saturday afternoon rolled around. The weather was absolutely perfect. 72 degrees, a gentle breeze blowing directly from the west. From my barn, facing east, the wind was pushing straight up the hill, right toward the oak tree. Around 3 in the afternoon, the guests started arriving. They parked down in the subdivision and walked up the little path Brenda had mowed through my lower pasture. They were dressed to the nines, men in sharp navy suits, women in pastel silk dresses and wide-brimmed hats. I watched them through a pair of binoculars. I saw a string quartet setting up in the corner of the tent. They started playing some classical music that drifted down the hill on the breeze. At 3:45, Brenda arrived. She was wearing a floor-length silver gown that caught the sunlight. She was bustling around, seating people, pointing her fingers, looking like the queen of her own little stolen kingdom. Dave was sitting on a hay bale near the tractor. He checked his watch. 4 o'clock, he said. Showtime, I said. I climbed into the metal seat of the tractor. I turned the key. The old diesel engine roared to life, shaking the rust off the fenders. I gripped the steering wheel. My heart was thumping a steady rhythm against my ribs. Before I drop this tractor into gear and ruin a perfectly good pair of white shoes, take a second to hit that like button. It shows you value a little justice in the country, and it helps me keep publishing these stories. Okay, let's go fertilize some grass. I threw the tractor into a low gear and rolled slowly out of the barn. I did not speed. I drove at a creeping, steady pace, exactly the way you were supposed to when you were doing agricultural work. The engine chugged loudly, announcing my presence long before I reached the hill. As I crested the ridge, I saw the heads start to turn. The string quartet missed a note. The men in navy suits squinted into the sun, trying to figure out why a massive piece of farm equipment was rumbling toward their elegant outdoor venue. I drove parallel to the tent. I stayed exactly 20 feet away, close enough to be a presence, far enough away that I was not a physical threat to their rented chairs. I kept the tractor crawling along the property line. Then, I reached down and engaged the power takeoff lever. Behind me, the steel auger roared to life. It spun up to speed with a heavy mechanical whine. I reached over and pulled the release valve on the tank. The slurry hit the spinning blades. It erupted from the back of the spreader in a glorious, dark, brown fan. The machine threw it high into the air, a thick, heavy mist of pure agricultural gold, and the gentle western breeze caught it instantly. The wind took that mist and carried it straight through the open sides of the white marquee tent. It did not hit them like a water hose. It was so much worse than that. It was a fine, settling dew. It drifted down like an invisible, unholy fog. The smell hit them first. I watched the front row of guests. A man in a light gray suit suddenly wrinkled his nose. He looked down at his shoes. The woman next to him put her hand over her mouth. The string quartet stopped playing entirely. The cellist actually dropped his bow. Then, the mist began to land. It settled on the white linen tablecloths, leaving hundreds of tiny brown freckles. It settled on the polished wood of the portable dance floor. It settled on the pink roses wrapping the floral arches. I kept driving. I did not look angry. I did not look vindictive. I just stared straight ahead, a hard-working farmer doing his afternoon chores. Chaos erupted. Chairs scraped furiously as people stood up. Voices began to shout. The elegant, hushed tones of a country wedding shattered into a dozen panic screams. A woman in a pale yellow dress shrieked as a droplet of slurry hit her bare shoulder. Men were grabbing their wives, trying to usher them out from under the tent, but there was nowhere to go. The mist was everywhere. The wind was relentless. And then there was Brenda. She burst out from the side of the tent, waving her arms frantically. Her silver gown was speckled with dark brown dots. Her hair, perfectly sprayed into a stiff helmet, was visibly damp with manure dew. She was screaming. I could not hear the exact words over the roar of the tractor engine, but the veins popping in her neck told the whole story. She started running toward the tractor. She wanted to stop me. She wanted to stand in front of the machine and force me to shut it down. But Brenda was not used to the country. Brenda was not used to unpaved ground, and Brenda was wearing 4-inch wedge heels. I watched it happen in beautiful, cinematic slow motion. She took 3 aggressive strides through the pasture grass. On the 4th stride, her right heel found a fresh gopher hole. Her ankle rolled. Her arms flailed like a windmill trying to catch a hurricane. She pitched forward, completely losing her center of gravity. For a brief second, she hovered in the air, a silver missile of pure rage. Then she hit the dirt. She did not just fall. She face-planted into the grass, the very grass that had just received a generous, misty coating of liquid dairy fertilizer. She slid about 2 feet, her silver gown collecting the damp earth and the fresh slurry. She lay there for a second, totally motionless. I thought she might be hurt, and my hand instinctively twitched toward the throttle to stop the tractor. But then she pushed herself up on her hands and knees. Her face was smeared with mud. Her pristine silver dress was ruined. She looked up at me, her mouth open in a silent scream, looking like a swamp creature that had just crawled out of a bog. I did not stop. I did not smile. I just kept driving. I drove all the way to the end of the ridge, made a slow, wide turn, and shut off the valve. The auger wound down. The mist faded. I shifted the tractor into a higher gear and drove back down the hill to the barn. When I parked and shut off the engine, the silence was incredible. My ears were ringing slightly from the diesel motor, but beneath that, I could hear the sound of car doors slamming down in the subdivision. Dozens of them. Engines starting, tires peeling out on the asphalt. Dave was still sitting on the hay bale. He had not moved. He finished his root beer, set the empty bottle on a wooden crate, and looked up at the ridge. "Looks like the party is over," Dave said. "Looks like it," I said. I walked out to the edge of the driveway and looked up the hill. The guests were fleeing. They were not walking down the mowed path. They were practically running, holding their noses, hiking up their dresses, desperate to escape the toxic zone. The string quartet was hauling their instruments away like they were fleeing a burning building. Brenda was nowhere to be seen. She had likely retreated to her house to scrub the top layer of her skin off with a wire brush. An hour later, a fleet of white box trucks arrived from the rental company. The guys in the matching polo shirts hopped out. They were wearing industrial face masks. They worked at double speed, tearing down the floral arches, ripping up the dance floor, and collapsing the tent. They threw it all into the back of the trucks with zero care, just trying to get out of the stench. By 6 o'clock, the ridge was completely empty. There were no chairs. There was no tent. There was just the old oak tree standing tall and quiet in the evening breeze. I never received a lawsuit. I assume Brenda tried to find a lawyer, but it is very hard to sue a farmer for fertilizing his own agricultural property during the proper season with standard equipment. The law might not have let me tear down her tent, but the law also protects a man's right to farm his own land. I did hear through the grapevine that the rental company charged Brenda a massive cleaning fee for the tent canvas. Several $1,000s, apparently. The niece ended up getting married 3 days later in a cramped community center banquet hall downtown. Brenda did not attend. Word was, she had suddenly come down with a terrible stomach bug. The HOA letters stopped entirely. My mailbox has been beautifully empty ever since. I have not seen Brenda near the property line once. If she is out inspecting the neighborhood, she makes sure to do it on the far side of the subdivision. About a week later, I woke up early. The sun was just starting to crack over the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and orange. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, put on my boots, and walked up the gravel driveway. I walked all the way up to the ridge. The smell of the fertilizer had faded, washed away by a couple of good rainstorms. I stopped under the old oak tree. I took a sip of my coffee. I looked down at the ground. Dave was right. The pasture had needed it. The grass under my boots was growing and thick, and it was the deepest, most vibrant shade of green you have ever seen.